Hello, good morning, good afternoon to all of you that have logged on. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I'd like to welcome you, a warm virtual welcome to our first Transatlantic Tuesday of 2022. As some of you have known from past Transatlantic Tuesdays, we take this format to look at the most pertinent issues in the transatlantic relationship. And today we're going to take stock of Biden's first year in office, look at the successes and failures. And we've got two great speakers who will be introduced by our moderator, Scott, in just a minute. And before I hand over the floor to Scott, I just wanted to explain the procedure for this evening. As always, we'll have a short moderated conversation for about 15 to 20 minutes. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and they'll automatically queue up and Scott will get to them very shortly. I'd also like to thank our Business Alliance for support of this programming at GMF Berlin. And with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to Scott Cullinane, who will introduce Ines and Bruce, our speakers for tonight. Scott is currently the Helmut Schmidt Fellowship, the Helmut Schmidt Fellow in our Berlin office, and is from DC originally, so is well versed could be on this topic. And without further ado, Scott, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suda. It's great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone in the audience. Welcome. For today's conversation, we have two really outstanding speakers to offer their insights for us. We have Bruce Stokes, who is a visiting senior fellow with GMF. He's the executive director of the Transatlantic Task Force, Together or Alone, Choices and Strategies for Transatlantic Relations in 2021 and beyond. Previously, he was the director of Global Economic Attitudes at the Pew Research Center in Washington, and is a former international economics reporter for the National Journal, a Washington-based public policy magazine. And with him, we're joined by the equally impressive Ines Pohl. Ines is the Washington bureau chief for Deutsche Welle. She served as the editor-in-chief of DW from 2017 to 2020 and joined DW in 2015 as a correspondent in the Washington bureau. As a journalist, she is particularly interested in questions of democratic legitimacy and transition. So thank you both. It's great to have you with us. We'll have this event for the next 45 minutes. And as Suda said, I'll start with a few questions I prepared, but I welcome everyone in the audience to please chime in and use our by now familiar Zoom function to offer questions, and I will pivot to those shortly. So as a place to start our conversation, I want to turn to Bruce. And you have an article out today, just this afternoon, published on the GMF website, titled A Transatlantic Rating of Biden's First Year in Office. And through that article, you look at a number of the promises and commitments that were made during the campaign and during the first year of the Biden administration, and talk about how those have been perceived in different European capitals. I certainly recommend and hope everyone will go to the website and read the article in full. But I wonder if I might ask you to share some of your main takeaways and conclusions in that article, please.
Sure, Scott, thank you. And thanks to GMF for hosting this event. And I look forward to the conversation with Ines and with the people who are online, and hopefully we have a good conversation. This report that is up today on the GMF website is the product of 50 interviews I did with experts on transatlantic relations, both in the United States and in Europe. And it's a follow-up to the task force report we released before the US election, looking at what we hoped might be able to be accomplished in the first year of the Biden administration. And so we wanted to do a one-year assessment of what had actually been accomplished in transatlantic relations in 2021. I think that the most important thing to take away from those conversations and the work of the task force actually was that Biden at the 2021 Munich Security Conference said America is back. But the problem is, what he didn't say is there's no return to the status quo ante. And those who made the assumption that we are somehow going to return to some halcyon period before Trump, I think are not dealing with the realities we face in the transatlantic relationship. There's both opportunity and challenge in transatlantic relations in the second year of the Biden administration, but that's going to be based on what happened in the first year. There have been significant achievements. I mean, the most significant achievement, I think, from most transatlanticists, both European and American, is Biden's not Trump. Biden, I mean, we have to acknowledge, has probably spent more time in Europe than any American president since Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower spent most of his time in Europe during World War II. So Biden is a confirmed alliance person, a confirmed transatlanticist, understands Europe better than I think any American president we've had in my lifetime. And it shows. I mean, we've been able to solve some major trade disputes, Boeing, Airbus, and steel, aluminum. We have kicked those issues down the road or put them on the shelf, so people think that they will finally be solved. We struck a very creative deal around steel, where basically we're going to limit steel imports as much as possible to low carbon steel, which is a commitment to climate change, and maybe a model for future carbon intensive import legislation. We did a great methane deal at Glasgow, committing to ourselves and Europeans and the rest of the world to reduce methane emissions, which are much worse than CO2 emissions. We created a Trade and Technology Council. Europe and America drove the agreement on a minimum corporate tax. And we have developed a shared perspective on China, which I think going forward is going to be terribly important. The problem is we face significant problems. There was clearly a lack of consultation by Washington with Europe on Afghanistan. And I think feelings in Europe that the US still, the knee-jerk reaction of the United States is to act like a hegemon that it no longer is. We had a smaller problem, but still a problem with the French over the submarine deal with Australia called AUKUS. While I think the Biden administration has gone overboard to attempt to now consult with Europe because of the flare-up over AUKUS in Afghanistan, I must tell you, there is still a sense among some Americans who deal with Europe that for Europeans, consultation is never enough. And this, I think, gets to a fundamental difference between Europeans and Americans. Europeans value process more than Americans. And this will always be a problem between us, that Europeans have built the European Union through meeting after meeting, after consultation, and Americans just want to get to the cut to the chase. And this is that we're different people and we have a different history. And there were significant shortcomings in what the US was able to produce for the Glasgow Climate Summit. Interestingly enough, in my interviews with 25 or so European experts, they weren't that upset about that. And I think as they look at what's actually the US is going to be able to produce going forward on climate, they're going to become more upset. Now, that leads us to the challenges ahead. Ukraine and Russia emerging as a security problem for Europe and America is clearly number one. This, I think, highlights the need for more European security self-reliance. I didn't say the word that maybe the French would say, but I think self-reliance is the issue to use. And both because of Russia and also, frankly, because the American-Asian pivot is real. And even if Biden has increased the number of troops in Europe a little bit and recommitted ourselves to NATO, which Trump had threatened, we are pivoting to Asia, and that does have implications for the transatlantic security reliance. There will be more AUKUSes in the future where we choose to do something in Asia that Europeans don't like or feel abandoned by or neglected by. Taiwan is going to be an emerging issue. We have to decide what we're both willing to do if China increases its pressure on Taiwan. There is I think, looming issue. We Americans are asking Europeans to impose economic sanctions or about to impose economic sanctions on both Russia and China. And I think Americans don't fully appreciate that you Europeans are more dependent on the economies of Russia and China than we are. So it's much easier for us to do this than it is for Europeans, but this could become a source of tension, and we got to work through that tension. There's a question of where we go with the Transatlantic Trade and Trade and Technology Council, to avoid it becoming just a talking shop. Can we stay together in climate? Europe is moving ahead on a border adjustment mechanism, a border tax. The US opposes that. I mean, could this be a huge new transatlantic trade problem? It's also a climate issue, because how do you do climate change initiatives that Europe is planning without a border adjustments? I'm not so sure how you do that. There's the question of whether the German government on Russia, on climate change, much as France doesn't like it. The reality is the US it depends on the German government to be a partner, and this is going to be a challenge going forward. And finally, and I think the thing that came up time and again in the interviews I did was there is worry both in Europe and America about the trajectory of American democracy. Is the United States still the democracy that many Europeans once thought it was? The Pew Research Center's does surveys show that Europeans don't think the American democracy is the model it once was. And there is this lingering fear that Biden is just an interruption in a long-term trend of the United States towards autocracy, and what this may mean for cooperating with the United States, I think is a huge unanswered question. As one Swedish member of parliament said to me, it's not that I don't trust the United States, I don't trust your political system. So with that, I'll end.
Well, thank you for that. And you certainly highlighted the breadth of issues that are currently on the table as part of the transatlantic relationship in the US-German conversation. If I could, I'd like to follow up on one line that you had in your article about us having entered a new era in transatlantic relations. And I noticed, so many of those items you mentioned, are long-term items. They stretch beyond the confines of any one political administration. And I was thinking back to when I first got into this area during the Obama administration. And I remember that being a time of an unpopular US presidency being followed by a Democratic administration with a lot of potential, received with a lot of hope, a lot of fanfare. And then I remember a sense of perhaps frustration or disappointment at some point during the first Obama term that he did not live up to expectations. And I wonder if maybe we're having a small repeat of that with the Biden administration. And so I want to pose the follow-up question, are we stuck in perhaps a cycle of frustration and expectation followed by disappointment, or is there something really new? Are we really on a trajectory to a new relationship, or are we finding ourselves actually stuck in some sort of cycle we can't yet break out of?
Well, I do think that if you look at the Pew Research Center data, there was this steady decline in support for the US and for the Bush administration in the first decade of this century. Then when Obama was elected, there was just incredible increase in support in Europe for both the president and for the US. I mean, overnight. At that time, we asked people in Europe, what do you expect of this new guy? He's kind of unknown to Europeans. What do you expect of this guy, Obama? And Europeans said, well, he's going to end climate change. He's going to bring peace to the Middle East. He's going to, revive the economy. I mean, there were unbelievably expectations that could not be achieved, right? And 4 years later, we asked people, okay, Obama's now, and what do you, has he, no, he didn't bring peace to the Middle East, he didn't end climate change, but we still like him. And so I think we're seeing a repeat of that. People in Europe certainly disliked Trump. The bounce back in public approval of Biden in the United States was enormous right after the election. The question, which is the very salient question you ask, is, are we going to have another 4 years where people are disappointed in Biden? He didn't do everything we hoped him to do. We still like the United States. We still like the US president. Or because of this concern that comes up in conversation after conversation where people say, we increasingly don't trust American democracy. Will this mean that that pattern that you laid out, which I agree with you totally, whether that pattern may not continue? And I think that only time will tell, but I do think that Americans should not take heart in the idea that, Europeans might be disappointed in Biden, but they'll still love America. They'll still, support Biden. We just don't know. And I think what's the new issue here is this growing distrust of American democracy, which I would, as an American, I would say Europeans have a good reason to distrust our democracy.
Well, so on that point, let me pivot and bring Ines into the conversation. You're sitting in Washington. I'm sitting in Berlin. I know as I have conversations here with Germans, we talk about Biden, but people here are very aware of Biden's approval ratings and the approaching midterm election and the apparent likelihood for the Republican Party to have a very good election night come this November and perhaps recapture one, if not both houses of the US Congress. And so I wonder if you might share with us your thoughts about what explains this and why is it that Biden seems to be underperforming and be dogged by consistent low polling numbers. And so I welcome your thought on that, and please also react to anything Bruce has said so far.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a super interesting and important conversation. Yeah, I would like to follow up on one line Bruce said. Yes, indeed, President Biden is not President Donald Trump, but the United States are the United States. And we have to keep in mind, by the end of the day, it was only 70,000 or so votes, which kind of kept Donald Trump from staying in the White House. I'm not talking about the majority vote, but because of the Electoral College, if in certain places of the United States, 70,000 or so people would have voted for Trump instead of Biden, Trump would still be in the White House. So the outcome of the election, given the American system, wasn't as clear as we think. What I want to say with that, I think we really have to look what is going on in the country. We happen to be in Phoenix to cover the Trump rally 2 days ago, and it was quite interesting to see that his supporters have not changed a bit. And again, referring what Bruce says, yes, Biden is not Trump, but the United States is the United States. That is something I think we have to keep in mind when we try to explain what is going on in this country. Another worry I have, traveling this country really intensely, I've been on the road a lot over the last 12, 14 months, is that so many Americans turn their backs towards policies. They just don't care anymore. And also on the so-called liberal spectrum, they are tired, they are annoyed, they are hopeless. Many think that Biden might have been the right president when he got elected, but he might not be the right person for this, what is ahead of him, for these next 3 years. And to answer your question about the polls, I mean, to be fair with Biden, I mean, he inherited so many problems. I mean, he got into the White House just a couple of days after January 6th, after the storming of the Capitol. He inherited these never-ending wars Bruce was talking about. However good or bad the withdrawal of Afghanistan was performed, but that's something he inherited. Not to talk about COVID and the pandemic. He's facing so many problems that it doesn't really come as a surprise that his polls are so down. And it's also common, we also have to keep that in mind, that many presidents in their first year or so, they really go down in the approval rates. The big question here, I think, is really how Biden can find a way out of that. And quite frankly, I mean, I talk to many experts, I talk to many people on the ground, and there is little light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, the kind of how COVID and Omicron will kind of keep evolving, that's not really in the hand of Joe Biden. He does everything. Maybe he was a little late in making tests available to his fellow Americans, but he really, again, didn't inherit any plan how to deliver vaccinations. So I think his administration did a pretty good job when it came to that. Regarding China and Russia, yes, he's, I think, doing everything he can, but he needs partners, he needs Germany, he needs Europe. How reliable are those partners? Do they really speak with one voice? And just staying within Germany, does he really know what the German government by the end of the day will do, given the fact that the SPD and the Greens are on pretty different kind of ways when it comes how to deal with Russia, for example, in regard of Nord Stream 2. So it is a very, very complex and difficult situation for Joe Biden. And I just really want to underline what Bruce said. I think the biggest question really is if the American institutions will stay strong, or if democracy by the end of the day will be undermined. And what we are seeing, how when it comes to gerrymandering, how the voters' right are kind of endangered in many states, for example, in Georgia, with an immediate impact to the next elections. So I think it's just like realistic if one says the United States is not in a very good shape.
Could I follow up on looking at politics over the past year? Would you say that Biden has underperformed, or have Republicans overperformed politically? And I ask that, I remember back on the campaign, and a lot of the appeal, the campaign for candidate Biden was one of competence and being able to work with Congress. And I wonder if the inability to pass some of the landmark legislation that he's talked so passionately about might be contributing to some of this frustration. Or on the other hand, the Republicans have seemed incredibly disciplined in staying on message, even if that message is not always the best. So how do you think about that? You know, is Biden, has he underperformed his promise, or have Republicans surprised us in how well they've managed to get by a year after Trump?
I mean, Republicans didn't surprise me. They just did what was to be expected. They tried to destroy the Biden administration. They tried to make it impossible for Biden to gain any success, to get anything through which he promised and which he thinks is the right thing to do. What we really have to applaud him for, and I think that is not done appropriately within the United States and beyond, is that he really got the huge infrastructure bill through. That's something presidents have been working on since 50 years or so. we don't see like the positive outcome now, but I'm sure that like in 10 years or 20 years, or maybe even in 50 years, in the so-called history books, he will get a lot of praise for that. But there is no immediate outcome. People don't feel that in their purses, so they don't have an immediate kind of positive outcome of that bill. When it comes to the Build Back Better bill, which would be much more important, because people would immediately feel something from that. They would get immediate. They would have an immediate positive outcome for their lives. The problem is not only the Republican Party, it's the Democratic Party. And I think that's why President Biden really kind of changed his strategy and is getting now much harder on the other side, more as a message to his own people, that he only has a couple of months left before the midterms. And as you say, it's very likely that he loses the power, maybe even in both houses, and then his power will be very, very limited. So if the Democrats don't get their act together and stand behind the agenda of the Democratic President Biden, he can't do anything, because he only has this razor thin majority, as we know. So from his perspective, unfortunately, the Democrats don't perform that unity what the Republicans do, and that's something we have seen since many, many years. It's typical for the Big Ten party, the Democrats, with like people with very different takes. Many obviously members rather kind of fulfill the needs of their immediate voters in their states than thinking about the bigger picture. And that seems to be different in the Republican Party. As for now, they're still standing strong behind Trump because of many reasons. And that gives them the power of being unified. And that's the weakness of the Democratic Party, and therefore the weakness or the vulnerability of President Joe Biden.
I think that's really spot on. And I think the point you made about the difficulty of the president to speak to two constituencies, to either speak to his base or trying to cross the aisle. It's hard to do both at the same time. And I agree entirely on that point. For the next question, I wanted to turn to kind of the topic du jour, which is Ukraine and Russia. And a question to pose to for both of you. Bruce, I wonder if you might offer your thoughts on your assessment on how the Biden administration has done deterring Russia. It's certainly a criticism from the Republican right that we didn't see 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border when Trump was president, but now they're there with Biden. And and do you see any validity to that charge? And for Ines, I wonder, we have a new German government, and I wonder how we have Foreign Minister Baerbock was in Ukraine yesterday, in Moscow today, and I wonder how you're seeing American politicians or American leaders responding to what might be a new German tack with Russia, or maybe more of the same. I'm curious how you see it being received. Maybe Bruce, please go ahead.
Okay, great question, but there has to be a caveat here at the beginning. My wife, Wendy Sherman, was the chief negotiator with the Russians in Geneva and Brussels last week. So
duly noted.
Duly note that, and what I'm about to say is not what she might say, and but one should take it with a grain of salt. Look, Republicans might criticize Biden, maybe, and they do. As you said, that Putin wasn't threatening Ukraine when Trump was president. Yeah, but Trump was Putin's buddy. Trump, cozied up to Putin on multiple occasions. I think that we don't know Putin's motivations. I think that in part it may be that Putin realizes that there's a great game going on, and Russia is increasingly not a player, and they want to be a player again and be recognized again as a global power. And the way you do that is throw your weight around. I'm sure they also take into consideration that Biden may look weak at home, and that Afghanistan hurt relations with Europe, maybe, and AUKUS, maybe, and we're pivoting to Asia, which certainly suggests that maybe, I think the Biden administration's hope was that they could put Russia on the back burner and wouldn't have to deal with it as they pivoted to dealing with China. And I'm sure Putin wants to be paid attention to. And I think we can't underestimate what may be driving Putin's desires, which could be both, he wants to be the next Peter the Great. And, that's his vision of the legacy he wants in history, to reunite a greater Russia, in his view. And also that while he's not threatened at home domestically, there may be growing domestic frustration with him. And the way historically you deal with that often is to create an external problem, to try to reunite the country. And even though the polling in Russia shows that people don't want to go to war with Ukraine, they don't want to, the reality is he may be banking on the fact that if we do, people will rally around the flag. So I think that, unfortunately for Europe and the United States, the ball is in Putin's court. He can either escalate this into war, or he can decide that we're finally paying attention to him, and as long as we're acknowledging that he's a player in the world, we'll deal on some issues. And we should know in a few weeks, right? Basically, the Russians are going to react to what we've suggested in Geneva and Brussels. Their initial reaction was, we don't accept this, but that's what you say the first day, and we'll see what they say as things play out. And but certainly this is not what the Biden administration hoped would be the issue they'd have to wrestle with.
I can definitely understand. I think in recent years in Washington, there's certainly been a lot of conversations with the idea that the US's priority will be China, the Indo-Pacific, and that Russia can be put on the back burner, as you say. And I think, unfortunately, maybe not everyone realized that Putin gets to vote, and yes, Russia can decide which burner they want to be on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you for that answer. Ines, please. I'd be very curious to see how German foreign policy and approach towards Russia is being received back in the US, particularly at this moment when we're thinking about deterrence and thinking about ways to respond if, in fact, there is another Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I just want to add one thought to Bruce's. I totally agree on his take. I think it's really true and right that Putin kind of uses the fact that the Biden administration has so many domestic problems to deal with and is so weak within its own country that might give him an opportunity to play strong. He wanted to be back on the world stage, and that's exactly what he got. And that's something I wanted to add is he's facing tremendously economic problems within his own country. And as you said, as always, or as Bruce also said, if you have like internal problems, it's always easy to or it's always a way out to focus or to start a war, or at least to threaten to start a war. When it comes to Germany, during the elections, there was a huge hope for a Green chancellor here in many parts of the Biden administration, at least. Why? Because obviously the Green Party is really strong on fighting the climate crisis, and that was a declared goal of the Biden administration, the climate czar John Kerry, and all the promises Biden made during his campaign. As we all know, the outcome was different. We now have a social democrat as a chancellor, which was really kind of not on the agenda just only like 3 or 4 months before the election day, nobody really expected the Social Democrats to win. But now we have Olaf Scholz as our chancellor, and sure, he's now the boss of the political Germany. So the Biden administration definitely got more interested in him and his party. I mean, that's probably interesting for our international audience, because I don't know if everyone is aware that it was Gerhard Schröder, also a social democrat, who started Nord Stream 2, this pipeline which causes so much headache for the Biden administration. And this is, from an American perspective, I think kind of an area with the social democrats. They don't really know how Olaf Scholz and the current administration will deal with. Will they stick to the plan to finish the pipeline? Will Germany try to get more independency from the Russian energy? Because as for now, this is our biggest energy giver. Like Russia is very, very important for Germany, not only when it comes to our economy, but basically only when it comes to energy supply. We highly rely already on Russia, and it is a little bit uncertain how the new administration will handle all that if Putin really would put more pressure on Ukraine. I think it's very likely that if Putin really would invade Ukraine, then they would stop that project. But on my personal take, I think it's unlikely that he does it. He might use other ways, but that would be probably a red line. But what if it's kind of not quite there? If he sends like the, non-official soldiers in Ukraine and puts more pressure on this country, how would Germany react? That's an open question. What we see is kind of, I think, two messages. On the one hand, we have our new foreign minister, as you said, Annalena Baerbock. She's talking pretty tough. She makes it really clear that there is this red line and that Germany will take action if Putin reacts in that way or the other. She also is much tougher when she talks about China and human rights issues. But by the end of the day, the government is led by Olaf Scholz. To make a long answer short, it's going to be really interesting to see, and I think it's not decided yet. But I think what Americans and all other partners of Germany can rely on, that if Putin really would invade Ukraine, then Germany would pull the plug, especially when it comes to Nord Stream 2 and other corporations.
Thank you for that. In the 10 minutes or so we have left, I want to make sure I get in some audience questions. And so I have one here I'd like to pose, perhaps to Bruce first. And the question is, will Boris Johnson's Britain be an asset or a problem for Biden, especially regarding the relationship with Europe? I think it's a very interesting question. I'd be curious to hear your answer.
I'll tell you, I've been working on this task force and the follow-up to this task force for more than 2 years. This is the question that stumps almost everybody. Nobody has an answer of what the future of transatlantic relations should look like now that Britain is no longer part of the European Union. It's this, island floating off there in the Atlantic Ocean. And obviously the US has strong security ties with the UK. In this Ukraine crisis, we definitely look to the UK for support, and they've actually been probably among the European allies the most supportive of what we're doing. There's the Five Eyes in sharing of intelligence. There's these long cultural ties with Britain, but Britain is no longer in the EU, so it can no longer be the way in which we kind of try to influence the deliberations inside the EU. The Johnson government is irascible, to say the least. It's a little difficult to predict. The Brits wanted a free trade agreement, which the Biden administration doesn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. There's always this problem that the Johnson government may stir up troubles in Northern Ireland again. And let me tell you, this would really upset Joe Biden, who's Irish, and a lot of Irish American politicians in Congress. And so, to my knowledge, and there may be some knowledgeable people who have figured out how to do this, there's really no good solution about how we deal with the UK as this kind of third actor in the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States. And then what do we do with the UK? And I actually think it's one of the real challenges we face. And I don't see, at least again, it's limited to the people I've talked to, I don't see much creative thinking in Washington or in Brussels or in Berlin about this, or in Paris. Paris, definitely not. The French are still upset about the UK being involved in AUKUS. So and over fishing rights. So I mean, I think that if you put aside China, you put aside Russia, and you said, what is the big unanswered question in transatlantic relations? It's like, what in the world do we do with the UK? Because we both need the UK, and we don't know how to kind of integrate that into our thinking and our planning and our policies.
Thank you. And for Ines, maybe the same question. From a German perspective, I'm not sure Berlin has fully realized how Brexit has shifted power to Paris and to Berlin, and relatively how important, how much potential Berlin has as a partner for the U.S. in all of those things Bruce laid out in his first answer. So when you look to Berlin and when you look to German policymakers, how are they thinking about Boris in the current state of the EU, UK, US relationship?
That's a very good question. I think first of all, nobody knows how long Boris Johnson will stay in power. That's another thing, which is adding something, right? I mean, what will happen within UK over the next couple of weeks or months? That's something that kind of adds another uncertainty in the whole discussion. Has Germany not really realized the increase of its power? I think it's coming back to this old problem. Germany might be still afraid to take, or not ready yet to take the responsibility it should take. Brings us back to this old thing. Germany is too big to be just like one of the regular players within the European Union, but it's really too small to really take the lead. And given our history, we still have our problems in really being that strong forward as we might need to be in some areas. I'm talking about international security, national security, and being involved in all that. So it shall be interesting to see if the new government is willing to really fulfill these demands, because I agree with you. Germany did become a bigger player after the UK left, and it's down to especially with all the problems within the European Union, it's down to France and Germany even more so than it used to be when Britain was still there. But it's still too early, I think, with our new government to really see if they will take on that responsibility. And we also have to be fair. This new government has also a tremendous internal problems, domestic problems within Germany, given COVID, given the economy, and then also within the European Union, given Poland, and I'm Hungary. I mean, all these other countries which really kind of give a huge challenge to the European Union. But it shall be interesting to see, and I think over the next 3 or 4 months, we will know much more.
Thank you for that. I'd like to close on one final question. We've talked so much about Biden's first year. And to close, I want to ask a question about the upcoming year, Biden's second year. And this comes from an audience question observing about Biden's thin majorities in Congress. Where do you think he might or should invest his political capital? What would it be smart for him to do in the next 10 months, while he still has for certain majorities in Congress, if you were an advisor, what would you tell him how should he spend that capital in the next 10 months? What would your recommendations be?
First off, I would advise him to say, that you should do the right thing and don't expect it to rebound to you politically, because there's in Washington among political types, it's what do we do to win the congressional elections? And I think Ines is right. The chance of the Republicans winning the House of Representatives is almost a given, right? In the elections we've had, where in the first after 2 years of a presidency, where a president's approval rating is below 50%, the average loss of his party in the House of Representatives is 49 seats. This is likely to be a tidal wave of Republican victories in November. So I think there's probably nothing Biden can do about that, except that he should do the right thing, which means if that means he can get some parts of the Build Back Better legislation passed, then they should try to do that. Although, as Ines pointed out, at the end of the day, the Republicans have stayed united in denying Biden the ability to do anything. And so that gives them the power to two, what I would call dinos, Democrats in name only, Manchin and Sinema, and whether they'll be willing to agree. And there doesn't seem to be much they're willing to agree to. But progressives will have to swallow hard and accept much less in this new year. And then the question is, will the American voter actually even appreciate that? And I think the thing we have to realize is that despite everything Biden has accomplished, and Ines laid out some of that. I mean, we have 3.9% unemployment. We have more jobs created last year than in any time since 1939. We have record high stock market. And yes, we have inflation, but that's really the only downside of the economy. And yet, 63% of the public in a Washington Post poll says that the Biden administration has accomplished nothing. So that would suggest that it's going to be really hard, even though 200 million Americans have gotten a vaccine, more than 200 million have gotten a vaccination. The American public doesn't believe Biden is handling the COVID pandemic well. I mean, it may be that the attention span of the American public is so short and their demand for results is so high, unrealistically high, that whatever he does over the next 10 months is not going to save the Democrats in the congressional elections. So he should do what's right and what's the good thing to do, what he thinks is the good thing to do, and then let the chips fall where they may.
Well, I think
I would like to ask,
yeah.
I add something real quick. He has to protect the voting rights.
Absolutely.
Because if this gerrymandering goes on, then it doesn't even matter if he has the majority or not, because people won't be able to vote. And this is something I'm kind of surprised that he doesn't put more pressure on that, because this will shape the future of the country forever. If the voting map is changed the way many Republican governors and states want to do that and already are doing that, it is over. Because the Democrats will never be able to get the majorities they need, even so if they would have it. So I think that definitely should be a focus of his next, his last probably 8-9 months when he really can do something, because that's the last 8-9 months he has the majority to fulfill some of these tasks.
And it's not clear that Congress will be willing to pass, the Senate will be willing to pass any of these voting right legislation. So I think the question is going to be, what is the Biden Justice Department willing to do in terms of suing these states and trying to block what they attempt to do? Yes. Will the courts at least maintain that blockage through the 2022 election? Let's remind ourselves. The people around the insurrection, the Bannons and the other Republicans that are being, questioned about the insurrection, are betting that they can tie up their demands for testimony in the courts until the Republicans control the Congress again next year, and then the investigation goes away. I think the Biden Justice Department has to say, well, we too can play that game. We will sue every state that tries to limit voting, and we can hope to tie it up in the courts for so long that these limitations on voting don't work through the 2022 election. It is not the preferred way to handle this. The preferred way is what Ines was suggesting. We should protect voting rights in a straightforward manner, but I don't think that's going to happen in this Congress.
Well, on that note, I think we have to close our conversation. But what I hear is a Biden administration with significant challenges, both abroad and at home, that's going to have a lot to work on in the coming months. But I want to thank you both for offering your insights and for being with us today. Thank you to our wonderful audience for your questions and for joining us. Please check out Bruce's latest article on the GMF website, and I look forward to seeing and welcoming everyone back at a future Transatlantic Tuesday. Thank you.
Bye-bye.